Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mrs. G's Story Time. We are reading Star of Light by Patricia St. John with permission of Moody Publishing Company. And we are reading Chapter 5, Jenny Learns a Hard Lesson. Haman welcomed the coming of spring and the warmer weather. Winter is hard when your only clothes are rags, and the clothes that the English nurse had given him had fallen to pieces, but this no longer mattered. Now the sun shone warm and comforting. The storks nestled in the towers, flowers clothed the mountains, and cherry and peach blossoms made the valleys beautiful. Baby goats skipped and jostled in the streets, and Haman, like all the other young things, had grown several inches and looked more like a scarecrow than ever. He sat on the step of the donut stall, licking the oil off his fingers and watching the seething market with the bright, observant eyes. There was so much to see on the market days, and amid all the busyness of the people coming and going, Haman saw Kinza in a scarlet jersey prancing along between Jenny and the English nurse who had come out to do her shopping. Then in a flash, he caught sight of something else. He thought he was dreaming for a second, and he rubbed his eyes and looked again. He was not dreaming. He went white underneath his tan and turned a backward somersault into the shop and hid himself securely between the stone oven and the donut counter. Then he peeped out, like a startled rabbit from its hole, to watch what would happen next. His stepfather stood rigid in the doorway across the aisle, staring fixedly at the little group who was buying oranges, unaware of him. Then, drawing a step or two nearer, he watched Kinza as a snake might watch a baby rabbit at play, awaiting its moment to strike. His keen eyes were taking in everything: the blind gestures, the happy freedom of the baby talk, and the stout little shoes and the warm clothes. As the three went over to the oil merchant's shop, he followed, coming so close to his stepdaughter that for one breathless moment, Haman wondered if he was going to snatch her. But he did not touch her. He merely moved behind them unnoticed at the jostling crowd, and Haman saw that his black eyes burned with anger and his mouth was as closed as tightly as a steel trap. Haman, recovering from his first shock, was not afraid. His stepfather had come to the market on business. They would probably leave the town that evening. He had not seen Haman, nor would he see him, for at the earliest possible moment Haman would run off into the mountains and keep company with the monkeys until after dark. He did not worry about Kinza at all. She was in a safe keeping of the English nurse, who loved her and would never let her go. Her home was a fortress that Sir Muhammad could never enter. Haman's master arrived quite soon and was surprised and annoyed to find his assistant under the counter instead of behind it. He boxed his ears, while Haman did not mind in the least, and took some money off his pay, which he minded quite a lot. Once released, his nimble brown feet crisscrossed the dangerous zone of the marketplace where his stepfather lurked. He made for the cobbled path that ran along the outskirts of the town. Kinza and Jenny and Rosemary made their way home, never noticed at the sinister figure of a man who followed them as far as the entrance of the street and stood watching until the door of the house closed behind them. It was almost time for the clinic to open, and usually while Auntie Rosemary worked there, Kinza sat on the front step in the sunshine and talked to her kitten, and the patients stepped around her and over her. But during the past 2 weeks she had often gone to play with Jenny, who loved looking after her. So now, with her new storybook that she had brought to show her aunt in one hand and Kinza holding on to the other, Jenny set off to find her mother and father at the hotel. The little girls threaded their way through the market crowds and entered the Tower Gardens, which lay between them and the hotel. There was no one in the gardens, for everyone was busy in the market, and the sleepy silence made Jenny want to linger. She thought of her new book. She had just reached an exciting part, and this would be a lovely quiet place to sit and just read for 5 minutes. Her mother had told her she was never to stop between her aunt's house and the hotel, but after all her mother did not know what time she set out. She sat down in a pleasant little stone corner near the old archway, with Kinza beside her, and began to read her book. It was a story about a child just like Jenny, who had a pony of her own and rode in horse contests just as she was going to do when she got home. She hardly noticed that Kinza had gotten up and started to wander along the path towards the archway. Kinza often went for little walks, and her arms held out in front of her to avoid danger. And when she felt she had gone too far enough, she would just stand still and squeak until someone fetched her back. Jenny read on eagerly, for she wanted to reach the end of the chapter and discover whether Annabelle's pony was going to win the cup for jumping or not. And out of the corner of her eye, she could see Kinza standing in the archway. She could fetch her back in a minute. She skimmed to the end and got up quickly with a sigh of relief, because Annabelle had won easily. But she felt guilty for having left Kinza stray through the archway alone. "Kinza," she said eagerly, running into the other part of the garden, and then she stopped short and her eyes grew big with fright. For the green grass in front of her was empty and deserted. There was no sign of Kinza anywhere. With her heart beating wildly, she ran from bush to bush, searching behind every one. Up and down the steps she flew, back into the walled garden, but it was no good. Kinza had completely disappeared. Jenny rushed out into the market, half blinded with panic, bumping into people who turned to look at her anxiously, pushing her way in and out, searching frantically with her pale, tear-stained cheeks and big frightened eyes. At last she stood still, completely out of breath, and because there was nowhere else to look, and because she did not like people staring at her, she went back to the garden and stood alone by the archway, trying to decide what to do next. She simply could not go back. Aunt Rosemary had trusted her alone with Kinza, and she had failed completely in her trust. What would her aunt say? And worse still, where was Kinza? Had something terrible happened to her? Was she frightened or hurt or crying out, wondering why Jenny did not come to her? Jenny did not know. She burst into tears and ran sobbing to the hotel, up the stairs to her mother's room, and burst into her arms. Mrs. Swift finally managed to understand what had happened, and she went rather white too. She dried Jenny's eyes and took her by the hand. "We must go and tell Auntie Rosemary at once," she said quietly. "We'll have one more look in the marketplace on the way." Jenny stood quite still. "I can't go to Aunt Rosemary," she said tragically. "I just can't, Mummy. You'll have to go and tell her." "No," said Mrs. Swift, still quietly but very firmly. "You must go and tell her yourself. You see, Jenny, this has happened because you were disobedient and untrustworthy, and you must be brave and take the blame that you deserve. We must go now at once, because if anyone has taken Kinza, every moment may matter. Daddy will come with us." It was a silent little party that set out from the hotel, and Mr. Swift suggested he should do one more quick search of the marketplace while Jenny and her mother searched the gardens again. 10 minutes later they met again, solemn and worried. "Well," said Mr. Swift, "the sooner we get Rosemary into this, the better. She can speak the language and question the people." They met Rosemary coming across the market to look for Kinza at the hotel, as it was dinner time. Mr. Swift told her what had happened, and when he spoke, Jenny stood a little apart, her eyes fixed on the ground, not daring to look at her aunt's face. She wondered what her aunt would say and whether she would be angry with her right in the middle of the market, but nothing was said about her carelessness just then. Everyone seemed to have forgotten about it, and all they were thinking was about Kinza. They went back to the walled garden to see the exact place so that Rosemary could question the shopkeepers nearest the spot, but no one could give her any news. Whatever had happened just on the other side of the archway, and the archway was hidden from the road by the high wall. There were 3 exits from that part of the garden, and one led straight out onto a lonely country road that branched off into the next couple of miles into a dozen wild mountain tracks. "There are 2 possibilities," said Rosemary at last, when all questioning had proven useless. "One is that she's been kidnapped for the sake of her clothes, and in that case the police might help us. The other is that her own people have decided they want her back and have stolen her away. In that case, I'm afraid she's gone for good. After all, I have no claim against her own people. I don't even know where she came from. I only know that she's not a local child." She stopped short as a new idea came into her head. "I wonder where Haman is," she went on eagerly. "I've often thought he had something to do with her. He might be able to give us some clue." But not one of the boys had collected to see what was going on knew where Haman was. He had been at his job that morning and was last seen heading for the mountains. Everyone volunteered to go look for him, and they scouted in all directions, for the Englishman would no doubt reward the finder handsomely. But no one succeeded in finding Haman. He was far up the ravine between the great rocks, throwing stones at the monkeys. So frightened was he of meeting his stepfather that he stayed there till long after sunset and missed the boys' meeting for the first time in many weeks. The police, when they heard the story, were polite and sympathetic, but not very hopeful. They promised to telephone the government outpost in the mountains to watch the main tracks and to check on the travelers. But even if the child was found, what was there to prove that she did not belong to her captors? There was no more they could do, so they went sorrowfully back to Aunt Rosemary's house to have some tea. But none of them felt hungry, and after a while Mr. and Mrs. Swift got up to go. Jenny, pale and wretched, followed them, still not daring to look at her aunt, who had actually hardly given her naughtiness a thought yet. She was far too worried about what could have happened to Kenza. Rosemary was glad to be left alone. She carried out the tea things and then came back in her little room and knelt down, meaning to pray for Kenza. But the kitten sprang up beside her, mewing for its little playmate, and under the cushion on which she rested her arms was something hard and knobby. It's Kenza's wooden doll. She gazed around the room, and there was Kenza's ball, Kenza's mat, Kenza's box of sweets that Jenny had given her. Everywhere she looked, there were signs of the missing, loved little girl, and Rosemary suddenly laid her head down on her arms and cried. Where was Kenza? What was happening to her? How terrified and homesick she would be, how helpless in her blind darkness. Oh, God, she cried, take care of her. Don't let her be hurt or afraid. Bring her back to me safely. As she prayed, she heard a little sob behind her and realized she was not alone in the room. She looked up quickly, and there in the doorway stood Jenny, white face and swollen eyes with crying. Jenny, exclaimed Rosemary, does your mummy know you've come? Yes, said Jenny with a gulp. I said I must see you alone, so Mummy brought me back to the door. You forgot to lock it, so I just came in, and she says, please, will you see me home when you're finished with me? I don't suppose you want to see me at all, because it was all my fault about Kenza. Oh, Auntie, whatever shall I do? The last words came out with a rush of fresh tears, and Rosemary drew the trembling girl into the room and shut the door and sat down beside her. You can't do anything, Jenny, she said gently. But God loves Kenza far more than we do, and He can do everything. Let's kneel down and ask God together to shelter little Kenza and comfort her and keep her safe. So they knelt down side by side, and Rosemary prayed that Jesus would protect Kenza. And Jenny listened and wondered, more miserable than she'd ever been before. It's all very well for Aunt Rosemary, she thought. When dreadful things happened to her, she had a place where she could find forgiveness and peace and comfort. But Jenny knew no such refuge. She felt shut out in the dark. She would never forgive herself, and neither would anyone else if Kenza were really lost. For the first time in her life, her naughtiness had really mattered, and there seemed no escape from the terrible results of it. Nearly every day she was self-willed and lost her temper if she couldn't get what she wanted. But Mummy and Daddy were always nice and understanding about it, and remembered that, after all, she had been ill for 3 months. Now she had gone her own way and disobeyed once too often. If only Kenza could come back, said Jenny to herself. I would never be disobedient or naughty again. I'd be good forever and ever. Tomorrow we'll read chapter 16, The Rescue Plans. I love you, I'm praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.